My name is Manuel Catalan. I've given a class here before. I know some of you guys, so thank you guys for showing up again. So this is one of the Marines that works here under American Embassy Tashkent. I asked him to volunteer to do something that he feels like he likes doing. So one thing that he likes doing, he likes teaching people on, is on history pretty much. So this is going to be his first class. He made it from scratch. He did everything on his own. So if you have any questions, this is the guy to ask to. So if you guys can just give him some, some leeway. If you have some pointers at the end, give him some good feedback. I appreciate it. Thank you guys.
Thank you.
All right, so like you said, my name's Ethan. I'm going to be teaching you today about the American Revolution. So, anyone has any questions about it, and if you don't understand what I'm saying, just please feel free to raise your hand and just ask me. And if anyone does want to ask or answer a question, I do have chocolate bars for whoever chooses to do that. So, let's begin. And here we go. There we go. All right, so first we got to go over what led to the revolution, right? So here's where it took place. So England colonized the New World. So 13 colonies. These are 13 separate little entities, right? They all run themselves, and they're just colonies of England, which basically means England migrated there, conquered it, took it over. So French and Indian War. This was the war before the revolution. This was a big war. It was a global conflict, involved many countries: Spain, France, England, Prussia, Russia, etc. So as you can see in red, this all belongs to England. Blue, that is France. Green is Spain. So the war ended in 1763. And of course, wars cost money, so England took on a lot of debt. You have to pay for soldiers, their food, their guns, their ammo. So one of the ways they chose to pay for it was by taxing the colonies. So taxing the colonies wasn't the issue. The manner in which it was done was the issue. So the colonists had no representation in the British government, okay? So the British government was putting all these taxes on the Americans on items like tea, stamps, paper, lead, putting all these taxes on them, and they had nothing they could do about it, no say. And so what the Americans chose to do was boycott. So boycotting is basically the Americans said, we're not going to buy any of your products. We're not going to participate. So the British had to repeal a lot of their taxes because they weren't making money anymore. So they repealed all the taxes except for the tea tax, and they sent 2,000 soldiers to occupy Boston, which is a city in New England, which I will show you on the next picture. So what happened was the Boston Massacre. This happened when British soldiers fired on a crowd of Americans. Why it happened was, so people in Boston were very unhappy with the soldiers being there. They had to feed them, take care of them, live in their homes. Not happy with occupation, right? So when there was a British sentry, it's like a guard standing outside the customs house, which is a place where they deal with trade, they began to harass him. They started throwing stuff at him. They started throwing oyster shells, rocks, snowballs. More British soldiers showed up to support their friend. And what happened in the chaos was British soldiers fired, and they killed 5 Americans. Now obviously they were not happy with this. This only escalated the tension further. Okay, does anyone have any questions so far? Does everyone understand?
Yeah.
All right, cool. Oh, fuck. All right, so Boston Tea Party. So what happened was they repealed all the taxes and occupied the city, but they still had more soldiers, and they still left the tea tax. So what the Americans did was, one day, when a British merchant ship showed up with a bunch of tea on it, a lot of tea, a group of Americans known as the Sons of Liberty, led by Samuel Adams, they went on it dressed as American Indians and just threw it all overboard. So they just tossed it in the ocean, and obviously, the British aren't happy with that because this is their tea and they love tea. But so they can't have their colonists just doing whatever they want. So they're unhappy about that. So they send 3,000 more soldiers to England or to Boston, dissolve the Massachusetts General Assembly, which is like the local government, and revoke the charter, which is just a document stating what they can and can't do, what their authority is. So up until this point, the colonies were pretty much allowed to rule themselves, right? So after these acts, these were called the Intolerable Acts. Basically, England was controlling Boston and Massachusetts at this point. So after this, the 13 colonies, 12 of the 13 colonies sent delegates to Philadelphia, which is the American capital, would become the American capital. They sent delegates. They needed to discuss this, right? Because they can't have England just doing whatever they want. They don't like it. So they send delegates, 56 delegates to Philadelphia, and they discuss. What their plan is, they're just going to ask the British to repeal the Intolerable Acts. However, the British reject the request from the Americans, which leads the Americans to start arming. They get their guns, they start arming, the militias get together, and they basically say, all right, well, we're going to fight you now because you're being mean to us. So, how the British react is they decide they're going to go to Concord and take all the weapons and ammunition from the Americans. There's a lot of ammo there, a lot of gunpowder, a lot of stuff the Americans are going to use. So, the British head to Concord. However, some Americans in Boston ride ahead and go warn them. They warn the militias. So the British and Americans end up meeting in Lexington. This is what becomes known as the shot heard around the world. The British and Americans have a standoff until someone fires, most likely an American, but it's not really confirmed. So somebody fires and they start fighting. But the Americans are outnumbered, so they retreat back to Concord and the British chase them. But more and more Americans keep showing up. So eventually the British are outnumbered now. And they have to retreat all the way back to Boston. So this was the first battle of the Revolution. So the British are now retreating back to Boston. And the Americans besiege them. So right here is where the British are. This is Boston. It's where the British are. And the Americans have them surrounded. So the British, up until this point, the Americans didn't really have an army, right? They're just militia. Militia is just basically just civilians with guns. They're not like a trained or armed force. They're not trained or they're not professional. So, Continental Congress, they formally make an army called the Continental Army, and George Washington is put in command. Okay, so now the Continental Army is surrounding Boston. The British attempt to break out of the siege at Bunker Hill. And they take the hill, but they're unable to break the siege. So they're still under siege. And eventually, using cannons and big guns captured from Fort Ticonderoga, which is another British fort that the Americans captured, they're able to force the British to retreat via the ocean. Okay, everyone understand? All right, cool. So, siege lasted nearly 11 months. It was the first victory of the Revolution. So, at this point, it's 1776 now. So the Americans originally were hoping to reconcile with the British, but it wasn't really looking likely. You know, they'd been fighting, they killed a lot of guys, just not in the cards anymore. So they decide they're going to become independent. They picked Thomas Jefferson in June to draft the Declaration of Independence, and in July 2nd, Congress votes unanimously. Everybody voted, all of Congress voted in favor of independence. On July 4th, America became a country, 1776. So that's why July 4th is Independence Day. So, the British got kicked out of Boston, right? So obviously they're going to come back because they're not just going to get kicked out and not come back. So George Washington, he predicted this. So he moved his troops to New York. And this is Long Island. This is part of New York. So they move here to British land. The British beat the Americans really badly, They're able to outflank him, and they're able to push the Americans up against the river. The Americans are able to escape, though. But the British chase them, and they continue to fight them up Manhattan. So, and they ended up chasing them all the way through New Jersey, across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. Okay? Everyone following? So, American morale is low, obviously, because they just keep getting beat really bad. So, George Washington, knowing this, he knows he needs to win. The Americans need to win a victory. So, on December 25th, George Washington crosses the Delaware River. This is a famous picture. Crosses the Delaware River, and he ambushes, surprise attacks, a group of Haitian mercenaries at Trenton. So Haitian mercenaries, they're just German. The British hired them to fight for them. So that's what a mercenary is. The British hired these guys to fight for them. George Washington surprises them at Trenton, and they lose really bad. The Americans beat them really bad. And he eventually drives the British out of southern New Jersey. So, after the Americans have beaten British, like a lot, they come up with a new plan. Their plan, attack from Canada and New York at the same time, basically splitting the colonies in two, right? So they'd be a split right down the middle. Divide and conquer. They want to split up the colonies so they can pick them off easier, right? So, what they do, according to the plan, they're going to split them, right? But, guy in New York, he's all for personal glory. He goes and takes Philadelphia, the American capital. So he just kind of abandons the plan, and he leaves this guy up in the north to do it by himself. So the guy from Canada comes down, and he meets the Americans at Saratoga. And it was a Pyrrhic victory for the British. It means they barely won. They had super high casualties, barely won the battle. And then there was another battle at Bemis Heights. It was a decisive American victory. Just totally beat the British badly. And without reinforcements, the British had to retreat back to Canada because their guy in the south just decided to do his own thing. And an important event that happened after this, the Americans had been talking to the French. Does anyone remember the French from the French and Indian War? Remember? So, the Americans have been talking to the French. And the French decide after this battle, the Americans are serious, they can win, so the French decide to join the war. Now you might be wondering, why would the French join the war? Because they hate the British, pretty much. The British they're rivals with the French. So, French are basically willing to do anything they can to hurt the British. So the British changed their strategy again. They decide to go to the south, and they do see some success. They're able to take Savannah, Charleston. They win a decisive victory at Camden, just right here, right in South Carolina. Take that, Sergeant Reeves. So they're winning in the south, but the Americans are able to beat them at the Battle of Cowpens and at Guilford Courthouse. The Americans don't quite win, but they inflict heavy casualties on the British. Casualties just killed, wounded, or missing soldiers, okay? So that's what I mean by casualties. So the British beat them, or Americans beat them, and the British decide, you know what, this isn't working. The Americans are just getting more guys from the north, from Virginia. Let's go set up in Yorktown and attack Virginia, okay? Is everyone following so far? Any questions?
Yeah.
All right, cool. So they decide to set up in Yorktown. So they set up in Yorktown. They're prepared to go into Virginia. But the Americans, George Washington, who is currently in New York, and the French, they catch wind of this. They go down to Yorktown, and they besiege the city, surround them, and the French and Americans have them cornered. Now you might be wondering, why don't the British just leave by the ocean, right? That's what they did in Boston. Well, the French Navy showed up, and they basically blocked the exit. The British can't escape by the ocean anymore. They have them surrounded. So with no options left, the British are forced to surrender. And because of this, when the British government heard about their defeat at Yorktown, they decided the war is not worth it anymore. We're done. It's costing too much money, too many lives. Too many of our guys are dying. So, in 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed, ending the war. The results of the treaty, the Americans got all this land up to the Mississippi, official recognition by the British government. So America is officially a country, and British took all their guys out of American soil. Okay, 13 colonies are free; they're their own thing now. So that's the end. That's all I got. Any questions or feedback?
Can you please change it to the previous slide?
Yes.
U.S. territory gained by persecuted. So it took them